10 WWE gimmicks that WCW literally copied. Number 10, The Ultimate Warrior and the Renegade. Even though the Ultimate Warrior was the most acclaimed in-ring talent in the world, he had the charisma and energy to pull the Warrior gimmick off, and there's not a single name in wrestling history that could have delivered the gimmick as well as Jim Hellwig. In 1995, there were rumors that WCW had potentially signed Warrior to a WCW contract. These rumors surfaced after Hulk Hogan was promoting an Ultimate Surprise to debut at the uncensored pay-per-view, and to add fuel to the fire, WCW would even show a silhouette of a man who had long hair and tassels tied to his arm. In typical WCW fashion, this was a complete swerve, as it would debut a character known as the Renegade. This was a wrestler who was doing a cheap copy of the Ultimate Warrior's entire gimmick, and it wasn't exactly the surprise of the year when the crowd instantly rejected it. The main problem with this persona is that it showed that WCW, more specifically Eric Bischoff, was already starting to get out of touch with the WCW audience. What did WCW and Bischoff expect? Did they truly believe that the WCW audience were that naive to accept the Renegade as a second coming of their former WWE champion? Number 9, Jim Ross and Oklahoma. There are lines in pro wrestling that companies should never cross, and WCW crossed the line when they debuted the character known as Oklahoma. Vince Russo was responsible for introducing the character on TV in the late 90s, and this character was portrayed by former WWE writer Ed Ferrara. The idea behind the copycat gimmick was to humiliate Jim Ross. Whilst the content and characteristics of the gimmick were disgusting, it actually massively backfired on WCW, as JR is so beloved and celebrated that fans and fellow wrestling personalities were quick to call out WCW. It was never made clear what the long-term goal of the character was, and this was a worrying trend that the company had in the creative department during their final few years. Russo devoted so much time and resources into this dire character that he would even book Oklahoma to win the Cruiserweight title. The Cruiserweight title at one time was the highlight of WCW programming, yet virtually overnight, Russo had destroyed any credibility and aura the title and the division had left. Number 8, China and Asia. The WCW were getting so desperate in the late 90s that they even introduced their own version of WWE's China. WCW would debut a wrestler known as Asia. She would be booked in a manner that was similar to China, yet she had zero legitimacy as a wrestler, and China had the ability to just have a presence just by standing in the ring. This was something that Asia just simply didn't have. WCW would book her to be the bodyguard for the Revolution stable, and the idea here was to replicate the success of DX and China. However, there was a distinct lack of chemistry which led to the creative idea completely flopping. WCW would often remind fans on commentary that Asia was bigger than China, and this was so unbelievably forced as WCW were going out of their way to tell the audience that this gimmick was better than the China character, yet not even the core WCW audience were believing that narrative that they were spinning. Number 7, Crash Holly and Norman Smiley. In late 1999, Norman Smiley would become the face of the new hardcore division. This was an attempt to replicate the success of WWE's hardcore division and of course ECW. Even though the Smiley hardcore gimmick debuted before the late great Crash Holly would insert himself into the hardcore division, it's only when Crash became insanely over in WWE that WCW committed to booking Smiley to have numerous segments on the show. Smiley's work was outstanding in this role, as whilst he was completely ridiculous, some of his segments were the highlights of WCW TV product, as he had natural charisma and incredible comedic timing. Smiley rarely gets his flowers for positive contributions to WCW, which is a massive shame. However, it's wonderful to see that the inaugural WCW Hardcore Champion is still involved in the wrestling business as he trains the wrestlers of tomorrow at the WWE Performance Center. Number 6, Hulk Hogan and Randy Hogan. Randy Hogan is mostly known for his role as an enhancement talent in the 80s in WCW, and outside of having Hogan as his last name, Hogan sported a similar hairstyle and mustache as the Hulkster. Surprisingly, according to Randy Hogan, the actual Hogan never had an issue with the parody, and this was mainly down to Randy never getting in any controversy, something that the real Hogan can't relate to. Now, an interesting story about Randy Hogan is that in 1994, when Hulk Hogan signed for WCW, Randy was dispatched by a local radio provider to interview Hulk Hogan in relation to his WCW signing, yet unfortunately no audio clips of this interview are available for fans to enjoy. Number 5, Road Dogg and Buzzkill. Brad Armstrong was struggling to find a suitable gimmick in WCW in the late 90s, so it was decided that Armstrong would portray a character known as Buzzkill. This gimmick would be a parody of WWE's Road Dogg character, and the idea from Vince Russo at the time was clearly that Armstrong would be able to deliver a strong parody, because after all, he and Road Dogg were real-life brothers. The gimmick was basically a carbon copy and had no elements of uniqueness. Armstrong always looked awkward in any segments he was involved in, and the character was met with utter silence from the crowd. For the infamous gimmick, Armstrong used an entrance theme like the one used by the New Age Outlaws, and even this did little to get the gimmick over. This was a sign that WCW were creatively bankrupt in every department, as there was a distinct lack of new ideas and the product was crying out for an element of creativity and uniqueness. Number 4. Nails and the Prisoner. Nails was released from his WWE contract in 1992 when he reportedly attacked Vince McMahon backstage. This should have been enough to keep Nails away from the wrestling industry, as it was a sign that he had serious anger management issues, yet WCW just couldn't resist bringing him in. Nails would appear as the Prisoner, and WCW would replicate every single element of the Nails persona, and this ultimately had little effect. Nails would have one televised match in WCW as he wrestled the Icon Sting at the Slamboree pay-per-view. WCW would indirectly refer to the McMahon incident by stating that Nails was from the city in which he infamously choked McMahon. The match with Sting was utterly abysmal, and if a wrestler wasn't able to have a good match with Sting, especially in the early 90s, then they simply didn't have what it took to be a top guy in the company. Number 3. Earthquake and Avalanche. WCW once delivered a gimmick that was so close to a WWE character that WWE even threatened legal action. When Earthquake left WWE, he eventually found himself in WCW, and they would present him as Avalanche, and the gimmick was almost identical to what came before. It was confusing at the time as to how WCW managed to get away with it, however it was only a matter of time before WWE took issue with the parody of their intellectual property. WWE would insist that they change the gimmick, and WCW agreed, as Avalanche would become the Shark, a gimmick that must have taken around 5 seconds to come up with. Number 2. Team Canada and the Hart Foundation. In the summer of 2000, WCW began to debut a new stable on WCW television known as Team Canada. This stable would be led by Lance Storm, and it was a pro-Canadian, anti-American stable, and fans instantly knew that WCW were trying to copy the heel version of the Hart Foundation that WWE delivered so successfully a few years prior. WCW allowing one of the most technical savvy wrestlers on their roster to lead the stable was interesting, as Storm was clearly supposed to be their version of Hart, and the curious thing about the group is that Hart was a member of the WCW roster at the time, and even interacted with the group. And to their credit, WCW did attempt to add some unique elements to the group's presentation, mainly rebranding WCW titles to pro-Canadian names, and most of the work of the group was well received by fans. Extra praise should also be offered to Storm, who was incredible in the role, as Storm was one of the highlights of TV at the time, and his in-ring work combined with the heel heat he was receiving could have easily justified a main event run in the company. And number 1, Andre the Giant and the Giant. The Giant, aka The Big Show, arrived on WCW TV in '95, and he was labeled as Andre the Giant's son. He was dressed in a similar attire to Andre, and it was evident that he was directed to try and mimic his moveset and mannerisms. WCW would go so far as to even give the Giant no music, and this is the exact same formula that WWE used to keep Andre's mystique and aura intact. It was Hulk Hogan's idea to build the Giant as Andre the Giant's son. This is what Eric Bischoff had to say about the gimmick on his podcast.
Hulk was so excited about Paul White. Hulk, or anybody else that's been successful, is going to go with what they know. What's worked for me in the past? How do I recreate that? Make it feel a little different, but do something that I believe the audience is going to respond to based on my experience in the past, which is not a bad way to make a decision. He wanted him to be the son of Andre or whatever he was. That was all Hulk Hogan. So there was no discussion of maybe we should make him something else.
The Giant did manage to get somewhat over in WCW, yet this wasn't down to the Andre billing. It was mainly down to the Giant working with top names, and it was when WCW suddenly stopped the Son of Andre gimmick that the Giant was able to truly shine and show off his skill set. Speaking on T95, The Rock Station, this is what the former WWE champion had to say on the billing. That's how they did things back in the day. When you get introduced, you gotta have some kind of legacy and validity of who they are. And that was one of the ways they did it. Arn Anderson wasn't really Ole Anderson's nephew, stuff like that. There was a lot of that going on. Somebody related to somebody, that's why they're here. So they billed me as Andre's son, and we were off and running after that. The Giant would later sign for WWE and would arrive on the screens in 1999. The Giant, now known as The Big Show, would have major success in WWE, and he would embark on a Hall of Fame career. But there you have it, folks. 10 WWE gimmicks that WCW literally copied. Be sure to leave your comments down below, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.